What lies beneath the most sacred place in the Christian world? Deep beneath the majestic dome of St. Peter's Basilica lies an entire ancient city, a pagan necropolis with luxurious mausoleums where Romans from the 1st centuries AD are buried. Here, pagan gods coexist with early Christian symbols, and at the center of this underground labyrinth is a tomb that has been revered for almost 2,000 years. Secret tunnels used by popes to escape from their enemies. Apostolic Archives with 85 kilometers of documents. Modern bunkers from the Cold War era. All this is the underground Vatican, a multi-layered mystery beneath the feet of millions of pilgrims. Today, we will descend into these ancient depths and find out what the bowels of the sacred hill really hold. If you are interested in the mysteries of history and archaeological discoveries that overturn our understanding of the past, subscribe to the channel and like this video. And in the comments, let's discuss. Do you find the evidence of the authenticity of St. Peter's remains found in the 1960s convincing? Anthropological analysis, precious fabric, and archaeological context. Is this enough for definitive identification, or is the scientific community right to remain skeptical? I look forward to reading your opinions in the comments. In the fall of 1939, as Europe plunged into the abyss of World War II, workers in the heart of the Vatican were preparing a burial site for the recently deceased Pope Pius XIII. They worked in the dim light of the underground grottoes beneath the majestic St. Peter's Basilica, leveling the floor to create a fitting tomb for the pontiff. No one could have imagined that this mundane construction work would lead to one of the most sensational archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. One of the workers struck the floor with a crowbar and felt that there was a void beneath the layer of earth. When the top layer of soil was removed, a brick wall several meters deep came into view. This was not just old masonry. The wall clearly belonged to some ancient structure. Specialists were called in immediately, and after preliminary excavations, it became clear that there was a huge pagan mausoleum dating back to the 1st centuries AD under the cathedral. Pope Pius XIII, who had just ascended the throne, made a decision that shook the scientific world. Despite the war that had begun, he ordered a full-scale secret excavation under the main altar of the basilica. The goal was not simply to study the ancient burial site, but to find the answer to a question that had preoccupied the Christian world for almost 2,000 years. Did the remains of St. Peter, the first apostle and founder of the Church, really lie beneath the temple? 4 outstanding archaeologists were appointed to lead the project. Antonio Ferrua, a specialist in catacombs; Enrico Kirschbaum, an expert in early Christian archaeology; Engelbert Kirschbaum, and Bruno Maria Apollonia Getty. They had to work in incredibly difficult conditions. The excavations were carried out in cramped underground rooms with minimal lighting and the constant threat of the basilica's structures collapsing. In addition, everything had to be done in the strictest secrecy. The Pope did not want any information to leak out before the final results were obtained. The team of Sampietrini, hereditary craftsmen who had cared for St. Peter's Basilica for centuries, set to work. These skilled craftsmen had unique knowledge of every stone in the great cathedral and knew how to work without damaging its structure. They dug deeper, centimeter by centimeter, carefully documenting each find. With each passing day, an increasingly amazing world was revealed beneath the basilica, The first mausoleum, named by archaeologists as the Seten family mausoleum, turned out to be an elegant burial structure dating from between 130 and 170 AD. Its walls were decorated with frescoes and stucco, and there were funeral urns in the niches. But this was only the first discovery. When archaeologists began to expand the excavations, they realized that under the cathedral there was not a single mausoleum, but an entire underground city of the dead, an ancient necropolis stretching for tens of meters. Work continued even during the most difficult days of the war. In July 1943, when Allied bombers attacked Rome's railway junctions, killing more than 4,500 residents, archaeologists continued to work in the underground. Pius X was so obsessed with his search that he paid little attention to the catastrophe unfolding above his head. For him, the discovery of St. Peter's tomb was more important than current political events. By the end of 1942, the team had made its first truly sensational discovery. In a simple earthen grave, directly beneath the main altar of the Basilica, in the place that Christian tradition had always identified as Peter's burial site, archaeologists discovered human bones. Father Ferua and his team, together with the Pope, concluded that there was sufficient evidence to consider these remains to be the authentic relics of the Apostle. By personal order of Pius XVIII, the bones were placed in lead boxes and secretly transferred to the papal apartments, where they were kept for many years in the strictest secrecy. However, the discovery of the bones was only the beginning of a story that would stretch on for another 26 years and become a real archaeological detective story. Meanwhile, the excavations continued, revealing more and more burials, mausoleums, and artifacts. With each passing day, it became clearer that an entire ancient world was hidden beneath the Vatican, about to reveal its secrets to modern researchers. But how many more secrets does this ancient land hold? As the excavations continued, an astonishing picture unfolded before the archaeologists. The necropolis beneath St. Peter's Basilica was a veritable street of the dead. That is what the ancient Romans called such burials. Along the ancient Via Cornelia Road, which in ancient times ran along the northern slope of Vatican Hill, stretched the burial structures of wealthy Roman families. Each of them was a small temple of memory, built to last for centuries. Roman law strictly forbade burying the dead within the city walls. This rule was not just a tradition, but an important law that everyone, without exception, obeyed. It was believed that the dead should be separated from the living, and burial sites should be located outside inhabited areas. Therefore, along all the roads leading to and from Rome, necropolises appeared, cities of the dead, where wealthy citizens built family tombs, and the poor were content with simple graves in the ground. In the first centuries of our era, Vatican Hill was located far beyond the borders of imperial Rome. It was on the outskirts, not the most prestigious location, but convenient for burials. The slope of the hill, adjacent to Caligula's circus, was gradually built up with mausoleums. Archaeologists working under the direction of Father Ferua discovered as many as 22 burial structures on a site about 100 meters long. All of them were connected by a central passageway, forming an underground street about 4 meters wide. The mausoleums were located at different depths, from 5 to 12 meters below the floor level of the modern basilica. This was due to the peculiarities of the relief of the ancient Vatican Hill, and the fact that over time the ground level rose. Each burial site had its own architecture, reflecting the tastes and financial capabilities of its owners. Some mausoleums were modest, while others were striking in their luxury and size. For the convenience of research, archaeologists assigned each mausoleum a letter designation from A to V, using the Latin, Greek, and English alphabets. Mausoleum A belonged to the Abuti family, Mausoleum C to the Tullii, and Mausoleum F to the Catini. Some of the names of the owners were established from inscriptions on the walls and tombstones, while others remained anonymous. Each mausoleum preserved the memory of several generations of the same family. Grandfathers, fathers, children, and grandchildren were buried here, using the same structure for centuries. Inside the mausoleums, archaeologists found sarcophagi, funeral urns, and burial niches. According to estimates, more than 100 funeral ceremonies were held in some of the tombs. These were not just places of rest. They were family shrines where relatives came to honor the memory of the departed, make sacrifices, and hold memorial meals. Traces of such ceremonies have been preserved on the floors of some mausoleums. Remnants of food, broken dishes, and coins thrown as gifts to the dead. The central passage of the necropolis was a real underground street with a clear layout. Mausoleums stood on both sides, their facades facing a common path. One can imagine how funeral processions moved along this road in ancient times, carrying urns with ashes or sarcophagi with the bodies of the deceased. Relatives, dressed in mourning togas, followed behind, mourning the deceased according to Roman customs. Professional mourners sang funeral songs, and flute players played sad melodies. The necropolis functioned from approximately the 1st to the 4th century AD. The earliest burials date back to the reign of Emperor Augustus or Tiberius, and the latest to the time of Constantine the Great. This means that for almost 300 years, people came here to bury their dead. During this time, the necropolis witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the change of religions, and the transformation of Roman society from pagan to Christian. It is this transformation that has left the most amazing evidence in the underground halls. Archaeologists were particularly struck by the fact that the necropolis had been preserved in its original form. When Emperor Constantine began construction of the first St. Peter's Basilica in the 4th century, he ordered the ancient cemetery to be covered with earth and construction debris to create a level site for the temple. But before doing so, the workers demolished only the upper parts of the mausoleums, leaving the lower levels intact. Thus, the burials were preserved under a layer of earth several meters thick and served as a natural foundation for the basilica. They lay forgotten for 16 centuries until chance brought them back to light. But what else is hidden within these ancient walls? The Vatican necropolis was remarkable not only for its size, but also for the luxury of its decoration. Wealthy Roman families spared no expense in decorating their family tombs, seeking to create a worthy dwelling place in the afterlife for their deceased relatives. The walls of the mausoleums were covered with magnificent frescoes, the floors were decorated with mosaics, and the ceilings were painted with images of gods and mythological scenes. Each element of the decor had a deep symbolic meaning associated with Roman ideas about death and the afterlife. One of the most impressive discoveries was the so-called Mausoleum of the Julii, dating from the 3rd or 4th century AD. Its ceiling was decorated with an amazing mosaic depicting Christ in the form of the sun god Helios, ruling a chariot across the sky. This image became one of the earliest known depictions of Christ and demonstrated how early Christians adapted pagan iconography to express their religious ideas. The golden mosaic, which retained its bright colors after 17 centuries, was striking in its craftsmanship. The frescoes on the walls of the mausoleums depicted various scenes. Here you could see the abduction of Proserpina by Pluto, the myth of how the god of the underworld took the daughter of the goddess of fertility to his domain, condemning the world to the changing seasons. This story had a deep meaning for the Romans, symbolizing the cycle of death and rebirth. Nearby were depictions of the goddess Minerva, patroness of wisdom, and Jupiter, the supreme god of the Roman pantheon. Each image was intended to protect the deceased in the afterlife and ensure the favor of the gods. Christian symbols coexisted with pagan ones in striking harmony. On one wall, laurel wreaths could be seen, an ancient symbol of victory and immortality used by both pagans and Christians. On another wall was an image of Jonah, swallowed by a whale and spat out alive on the third day, which for early Christians symbolized the resurrection of Christ. Dolphins, a traditional symbol of salvation in the ancient world, were intertwined with anchors, a secret sign of the cross in early Christian tradition. The mosaic floors of some mausoleums were true works of art. From thousands of tiny colored stones, tesserae, ancient craftsmen created intricate geometric patterns, images of animals, and floral ornaments. In the mausoleum of the Valerii family, the floor was decorated with a mosaic depicting a peacock, a bird that symbolized immortality for the Romans, as it was believed that its flesh was not subject to decay. This same symbol was later adopted by Christians. The funeral rites of the Romans left behind a wealth of material evidence. Incense burners, lamps, and vessels for libations were found in mausoleums. The Romans believed that the dead continued to exist in the afterlife and needed food, drink, and everyday items. Therefore, coins were placed in the graves to pay Charon, the ferryman who transported souls across the river Styx. Jugs of wine were placed, and bread and fruit were left. Some burials contained the deceased's personal belongings, jewelry, tools, children's toys. Inscriptions on the walls and tombstones told about the lives of the people buried here. Epitaphs preserved names, ages, professions, and sometimes touching words of farewell from relatives. The freedmen of Emperor Nero rested here, former slaves who had gained their freedom and made careers in the imperial administration. Nearby, craftsmen, stonemasons, jewelers, theater managers found their final resting place. Some inscriptions reported the deaths of young brides or children who had been carried off by disease. Of particular interest were mixed burials, where those who had been cremated according to pagan custom and those who had been buried intact according to Christian rites rested in the same mausoleum. This testified to a transitional period when some members of the same family remained faithful to the traditions of their ancestors, while others embraced the new faith. Urns with ashes stood in niches next to sarcophagi containing intact bodies, and no one saw any contradiction in this. Archaeologists also found traces of memorial meals, a custom common to both pagans and Christians. In ancient Rome, there was a tradition of holding feasts near the graves of relatives on certain days. They brought wine, bread, and meat, ate and drank, symbolically sharing food with the dead. Christians continued this custom, transforming it into agape meals, brotherly meals in memory of the dead. Fragments of amphorae, animal bones, and ashes from sacrificial fires were found on the floor of the mausoleums. The luxury of some burials contrasted with the simplicity of others. Rich mausoleums stood next to poor graves dug directly into the ground between the burial structures. In these simple burials, bodies were found wrapped in shrouds without coffins, with a minimum of burial items. But even here, archaeologists discovered touching details: a coin in the hand of the deceased, a small amulet, a child's toy. Death made everyone equal, although wealth helped to preserve the memory of oneself for centuries. What other secrets do these ancient graves hold? To understand why a necropolis arose here, on the slope of Vatican Hill, and why this place became sacred to Christians, we must go back to the 60s of the 1st century AD. It was then that a circus, built by Emperor Caligula and expanded by his successor Nero, was located at the top of the hill and at its foot. It was a grandiose structure for equestrian competitions and other entertainment, capable of accommodating thousands of spectators. The center of the circus was adorned with an Egyptian obelisk brought from Heliopolis on Caligula's orders. This huge monolith of pink granite, weighing 327 tons, towered in the middle of the arena, symbolizing Rome's power over ancient Egypt. In 1586, Pope Sixtus V ordered architect Domenico Fontana to move the obelisk to St. Peter's Square, where it still stands today. The place where it stood in ancient times is marked by a special plaque near the modern excavation office of the Basilica. Nero's circus became the scene of horrific events in July 64 AD. On July 19th, a massive fire broke out in Rome, raging for 6 days and destroying most of the city. Of Rome's 14 districts, 3 were completely wiped off the face of the earth, and 7 more were seriously damaged. The people grumbled, accusing Emperor Nero himself of arson, allegedly wanting to clear the way for the construction of a new palace. Nero needed a scapegoat. The emperor blamed the Christians, a small but prominent community of followers of Jesus, a preacher who had been executed in Judea. The Roman historian Tacitus, who lived in the next generation, described the events that followed in his annals. He reported that first those who openly professed to be Christians were arrested. Then, based on their testimony, a huge number of others were arrested. They were accused not so much of arson as of hatred for the human race. The executions of Christians were turned into a public spectacle. Some were sewn into animal skins and thrown to the dogs in the circus arena. Others were crucified. Still others were used as living torches. They were smeared with flammable substances and set on fire at nightfall to illuminate the nighttime entertainment in the imperial gardens. Even Tacitus, who had no sympathy for Christians, wrote that the cruelty of the executions aroused sympathy for the victims, since they were destroyed not for the public good, but to satisfy the cruelty of one man. Among those executed in those terrible days was Simon Peter, one of the closest disciples of Jesus Christ. According to Christian tradition, preserved in numerous sources from the first centuries, the apostle was arrested in Rome, where he had arrived to preach the new teaching. There are several versions of the exact date of his martyrdom. Some sources indicate the year 64, others the year 67. The most likely date is around 64 to 65, during or immediately after the mass repression of Christians. The early Christian writer Origen, who lived in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, passed on the tradition that Peter was crucified upside down at his own request, as he did not consider himself worthy of dying in the same way as his teacher. This detail became an important part of Christian tradition. The The place of execution was in Nero's circus, or directly adjacent to it, on the slope of Vatican Hill, where the imperial gardens, Horti Neronis, were located. After the execution, according to the same tradition, the apostle's body was taken by his followers and secretly buried in a necropolis located not far from the place of martyrdom. This was a natural decision. Roman law prohibited the burial of executed criminals in public places, but relatives could take the bodies for private burial. The Christians buried Peter in a simple grave among pagan burials on a hillside. The members of the community knew and remembered the place of burial. About 100 years after Peter's death, around 160 AD, a small memorial was erected over his grave. The early Christian writer Gaius, who lived at the end of the 2nd century, mentioned this in a polemic with the heretic Proclus. He wrote, "I can show you the trophies of the apostles, for if you go to the Vatican Hill or on the road to Ostia, you will find the trophies of those who founded this church." By trophy, the ancients meant a monument to victory, in this case, victory over death through martyrdom. This trophy of Gaius, as archaeologists called it, was a small niche or edicule built into the wall and marking the exact burial place of the apostle. It was this that archaeologists were looking for when they conducted excavations in the 1940s. And when they found the remains of this ancient monument directly under the main altar of the Basilica, it confirmed the validity of the Christian tradition, passed down from generation to generation without written documents. But what did they actually discover? The trophy of Gaius turned out to be one of the key discoveries of the Vatican excavations. Archaeologists found it exactly where it was supposed to be, under the main altar of the Basilica, in a place that for 17 centuries was considered the burial place of St. Peter. The structure was dated to the middle of the 2nd century AD, which fully corresponded to Gaius' description. It was a small monument built into a red-painted wall, which archaeologists named the Red Wall. The Red Wall was built around 145 AD, specifically to protect and mark the burial place of the apostle. It separated the tomb from the rest of the necropolis, creating a sacred space. A small niche was built into the wall, in front of which stood 2 columns supporting a marble slab. This structure resembled a small temple or altar. In front of it, early Christians could gather for prayer and liturgy in memory of the first bishop of Rome. About 100 years later, around 250 AD, another wall was added to the Red Wall, named Wall G by archaeologists. This reinforcement was necessary to ensure the stability of the monument. It was on Wall G that archaeologists discovered numerous graffiti, scratched inscriptions left by pilgrims who came to worship at the apostles' resting place. The inscriptions were in Greek and Latin and included the names of worshippers, requests for intercession, and prayers for the dead. One of the inscriptions particularly excited the researchers. Italian archaeologist and epigraphist Margherita Guarducci, who had carefully studied the graffiti for many years after the excavations, deciphered the inscription, which she read as "Peter inside." In her opinion, this cryptogram clearly indicated that the remains of the apostle rested here, inside or under the wall. Other researchers disputed her interpretation, but Guarducci was convinced she was right. The burial site had been venerated continuously from the time of the apostle until the construction of Constantine's Basilica. This was evidenced by numerous finds. Near the trophy of Gaius, archaeologists discovered coins dating from different periods, from the 1st to the 4th century. This meant that for 300 years, Christians had been coming here, leaving gifts and offerings. Despite periodic persecutions of Christians under various emperors, the place remained a pilgrimage site. A particularly important testimony to the continuity of veneration was the fact that the exact location of Peter's tomb determined the architecture of all subsequent churches on this site. When, at the beginning of the 4th century, Emperor Constantine the Great decided to build a grand basilica in honor of the apostle, he faced enormous engineering difficulties. The slope of Vatican Hill was uneven, the necropolis occupied a significant area, and the hill itself required extensive earthworks. But Constantine did not look for a more convenient location. He ordered the basilica to be built precisely over Peter's tomb, despite all the technical difficulties. This required colossal work. The builders cut off the top of the hill and covered the necropolis with earth and construction debris up to a height of 10 meters, creating an artificial terrace. The upper parts of the mausoleums were demolished, but the foundations were left intact and became the foundation of the new temple. All this was done for one purpose: to preserve the exact burial place of the apostle in the center of the new basilica. The Constantine Basilica, built between 320 and 349, was a grandiose structure. 5 naves were separated by 88 columns. The temple was 120 meters long. It was the largest basilica in the Western Christian world at that time, and it was built as a monument to the Apostle Peter and a place to store his relics. The floor of the new basilica was at the same level as the trophy of Gaius, which was carefully preserved and incorporated into the structure of the temple. A luxurious marble structure decorated with red porphyry, a precious purple stone that in imperial Rome could only be used for imperial buildings, was erected around Peter's burial place. This marble ciborium protected and at the same time glorified the tomb of the apostle. It stood for more than 1,000 years until the construction of the new, modern St. Peter's Basilica began during the Renaissance. Excavations in the 1940s confirmed what ancient tradition had passed down orally for many centuries. Peter's burial place was not lost, forgotten, or become the subject of legends. It was preserved, revered, and commemorated consistently. First as a simple grave, then as the trophy of Gaius, then as Constantine's ciborium, then as a medieval altar, and finally as Bernini's Baroque baldachin, which we see today. The continuity of this tradition impressed even skeptical scholars. However, the main question remained: were the remains of the apostle really in this tomb? The story of the discovery of the bones of the apostle Peter turned out to be much more complicated than archaeologists could have imagined. In 1942, when excavations under the basilica reached the level of the trophy of Gaius, human bones were found in a simple earthen tomb directly under the monument. Father Ferrua and his team were excited. It seemed that their goal had been achieved. However, upon closer inspection, it became clear that the find raised many questions. The tomb had been partially looted in ancient times. The bones of several people and even animals were found in it, which immediately raised doubts about the authenticity of the remains. Pope Pius XIII ordered the bones to be removed and placed in special containers, but no further thorough investigation followed. The bones were transferred to wooden boxes and sent for storage to the papal apartments, where they remained for more than 20 years without proper scientific analysis. In 1952, when the main excavations were completed, Pope Pius XIII officially announced that St. Peter's tomb had been found. He based his announcement on archaeological, historical, and iconographic evidence, which he considered to be sufficiently convincing. However, the question of the authenticity of the skeletal remains themselves remained open. Many scholars expressed skepticism about this statement, but the story did not end there. Margherita Guarducci, a distinguished Italian epigraphist and archaeologist, professor at the University of Rome, participated in the excavations. This determined woman devoted decades to studying the graffiti on the walls of the Necropolis and never gave up trying to find convincing evidence of the authenticity of the remains. In 1963, she made a discovery that changed the whole picture. Guarducci discovered that an important detail had been overlooked during the excavations. In Wall G, the one that was added to the Red Wall around 250 AD, there was a small cavity covered with marble slabs. This cavity was located about 1.5 meters above the level of the original tomb. Giovanni Ceni, a worker who was helping with the excavations, removed a large number of bones from there and dumped them into a wooden box without attaching any particular significance to the find. The box with the bones from Wall G was stored in the storeroom of the Fabbrica di San Pietro, the administrative body that manages the Basilica. It was practically forgotten. Guarducci accidentally learned about these bones from Segni and immediately began an investigation. She suggested that the bones from the original tomb could have been moved by Christians to a safer place, the recess of Wall G, in ancient times, possibly during the persecutions of the 3rd century, or at the beginning of Constantine's construction work. With the permission of Pope Paul VI, the bones were handed over to anthropologist Venera Corradi for scientific research. The results of the analysis were sensational. The bones belonged to a single man of strong build, aged 60 to 70, who died in the 1st century AD. This perfectly matched what was known about Peter, a fisherman from Galilee, a physically strong man, executed in Rome at an advanced age in the 60s of the 1st century. Moreover, the bones were wrapped in a precious purple cloth with gold embroidery. Analysis showed that the fabric dates back to the 1st century and contains threads of real gold. Such luxurious fabric was used only for emperors or the most revered individuals. For early Christians, who were generally not wealthy, the use of such expensive material for the burial of an apostle was the greatest manifestation of reverence. This indirectly confirmed the special significance of the buried person. Another detail caught the attention. The bones of the feet were missing. Guarducci suggested that this could be related to the peculiarities of Roman execution by crucifixion. When the executed person was taken down from the cross, sometimes the feet remained nailed to the wooden base, and they were simply cut off so as not to waste time removing the nails. If Peter's body was buried in a hurry for fear of arrest, his relatives may not have taken his feet. In 1968, Pope Paul VI officially announced that the remains of the Apostle Peter had been identified. He based his conclusion on a combination of evidence: the archaeological context of the find, anthropological data, the presence of precious fabric, the age and time of death of the person, as well as the unbroken tradition of veneration of this particular place. For the Vatican, the question was settled, but the scientific community still debates the degree of reliability of this identification. At the beginning of the 4th century, the Christian world underwent a dramatic transformation. In 312, Emperor Constantine the Great defeated his rival Maxentius in the Battle of Milvian Bridge. According to Christian tradition, before the battle, Constantine had a vision of a cross in the sky with the inscription, "In this sign thou shalt conquer." After his triumph, the emperor issued the Edict of Milan in 313, legalizing Christianity and ending 3 centuries of periodic persecution. Constantine decided to immortalize the memory of the Apostle Peter with a grand temple. It was a political, religious, and symbolic gesture of enormous importance. By building a basilica over the tomb of the first bishop of Rome, the emperor legitimized Christianity not simply as one of the many religions of the empire, but as the official, state-supported faith. The location for the construction was not chosen at random. According to established tradition, it was here that the founder of the Roman Church was laid to rest. Construction began around 320 and continued for almost 30 years. The project was impressive in its scale and technical complexity. Vatican Hill was an inconvenient location for such a grandiose structure. Uneven terrain, a pagan necropolis occupying the entire area, and the need for large-scale earthworks. But the requirement was non-negotiable. The altar of the new basilica had to be located exactly above the trophy of Gaius, which marked the burial place of the apostle. Constantine spared no resources to accomplish this task. Thousands of workers cut off the top of the hill, demolishing everything on the surface. Then began a process that would shock modern archaeologists: the systematic filling in of the ancient necropolis. The mausoleums, many of which were true works of art and were actively used for burials, were ordered to be preserved. The upper parts of the burial structures were demolished, but the foundations were preserved. Workers cut down the roofs of the mausoleums and filled the interior with earth, construction debris, and stone fragments to the level of the future floor of the basilica. This process took place to a depth of up to 10 meters. In fact, the ancient necropolis was turned into an artificial foundation for a Christian temple. The filling was carried out very carefully. The earth was compacted in layers to ensure the stability of the future structure. It was this filling that preserved the necropolis for future generations of archaeologists. Not all burial structures were completely filled in. Some mausoleums, especially those belonging to influential pagan families, retained access via special staircases and shafts so that descendants could continue to honor their ancestors. This shows that even in the era of the triumph of Christianity, a certain tolerance for old customs remained. Pagan and Christian burials continued to exist side by side for several more decades. Gaius's trophy was carefully preserved and incorporated into the design of the new temple. A massive bronze grille and a marble ciborium decorated with spiral columns were erected around it. These columns, traditionally brought from Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, emphasize the connection between the new Christian basilica and the Old Testament tradition. Under the floor of the temple, directly above the ancient tomb, a crypt was created where pilgrims could descend to worship the place of the apostles' rest. The Constantine Basilica became the largest Christian church of its time. Its 5 naves could accommodate thousands of worshippers. Marble columns, many of which were taken from ancient pagan temples, supported the roof. The walls were decorated with mosaics and frescoes depicting scenes from the life of Christ and the apostles. The floor was laid with precious marble of various colors. Hundreds of oil lamps and candles were used for lighting. The construction of the basilica symbolized the final victory of Christianity over paganism. The Christian temple towered over the buried pagan graves, a metaphor for the triumph of the new faith over the old. But the irony of history was that beneath the main Christian temple of the Western world lay not only the remains of the apostle, but also hundreds of pagan burials, some of which belonged to the very people who had persecuted Christians during their lifetime. The Constantine Basilica stood for more than 200 years. It witnessed the coronations of emperors, the burials of popes, barbarian sieges, and the triumphs and tragedies of the medieval church. By the 15th century, the ancient building had fallen into disrepair and required either major repairs or complete reconstruction. In 1506, Pope Julius II made a radical decision to demolish the old basilica and build a new, even more grandiose one in its place. But in the new church, the main altar remained in exactly the same place, above the ancient tomb of the apostle. Continuity was not interrupted. One of the most surprising discoveries of the Vatican excavations was the discovery of numerous burials where Christian and pagan symbols coexisted in striking harmony. The necropolis under the basilica turned out to be evidence of a religious transition, that unique historical moment when the old faith gave way to the new. But the process was gradual, complex, and ambiguous. In the mausoleum of the Valerius family, archaeologists discovered the burials of 3 generations. The earliest ones clearly belonged to pagans. They were cremated according to ancient Roman tradition, and their ashes were placed in urns decorated with images of pagan gods. The next generation represented a transitional period. Some family members were cremated, while others were buried in sarcophagi without cremation, which was typical for Christians. Later, burials bore clear Christian symbols, although the mausoleum retained its pagan design. This pattern was repeated in many of the necropolis's burial structures. Families did not abandon their family tombs, even if the younger generation converted to Christianity. Christian children were laid to rest alongside their pagan parents in mausoleums decorated with images of Bacchus, Minerva, or Hercules. No one saw this as a contradiction. Death united the family more strongly than religious differences divided it in life. The symbolism of the burials showed the remarkable flexibility of the early Christians. They willingly used traditional Roman funerary images, filling them with new meaning. The grapevine, which for pagans symbolized Bacchus and the joys of life, meant Christ to Christians, who said, "I am the true vine." A shepherd with a sheep on his shoulders could mean both the pagan idea of philanthropy and the Christian Good Shepherd. The anchor served both as a symbol of hope in ancient tradition and as a hidden image of the cross for Christians. The peacock, often found in the frescoes and mosaics of the necropolis, was a perfect example of such a synthesis. The Romans believed that peacock meat did not decay, so the bird symbolized immortality. Early Christians adopted this symbol, associating it with resurrection. In the mausoleums beneath the Vatican, peacocks appeared alongside Christian monograms, and it is impossible to determine unequivocally which tradition they represented, perhaps both at the same time. The aforementioned mausoleum of Julius demonstrated the most striking example of religious syncretism. Its famous mosaic depicted Christ Helios on a solar chariot. The figure had a halo of golden rays, characteristic of images of the sun god. But the Christian context was obvious. Nearby were images of Jonah swallowed by a whale and a fisherman with a rod, clear Christian symbols. but they were juxtaposed with traditional Roman grapevines and birds. The inscriptions in the mausoleums also reflected this transition. Some began with the traditional pagan formula dis manibus, to the manes, an appeal to the spirits of the ancestors, but ended with a Christian blessing. Others used neutral wording that could be interpreted by both pagan and Christian traditions. The word rest or sleep in relation to death was acceptable to both religions. Archaeologists have found mausoleums where pagan altars for sacrifices stood next to tables for Christian agape meals or memorial feasts. Incense burners for offering incense to the gods stood next to lamps lit in memory of Christian martyrs. Amphorae, with wine for libations to the spirits of ancestors, could also be used for Christian Eucharist. The boundary between rituals was blurred. This religious coexistence reflected the reality of Roman society in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Christianity spread gradually, often through women and slaves, then encompassed other family members. The process could take several generations. The elderly head of the family remained a pagan. His son wavered between the two faiths, and his grandson was a staunch Christian. But they all buried each other in the same family mausoleum, with respect for tradition and the memory of their ancestors. The transition from paganism to Christianity did not occur through a sharp break, but through a gradual transformation. Christians did not reject the entire heritage of ancient culture. They adapted, reinterpreted, and filled old forms with new content. The Necropolis beneath the Vatican became a stone chronicle of this process, showing how two religions, considered irreconcilable enemies, coexisted peacefully in the realm of death at the level of ordinary families. Are there still traces of this amazing synthesis in other underground halls of the Vatican? The Vatican's secret underground passages are not just an ancient necropolis. Over the centuries, a whole network of tunnels, corridors, and secret passages was created under the papal estates, many of which served as escape routes and hiding places in times of danger. The most famous of these is the Passetto di Borgo, a secret corridor connecting the Vatican with the Castel Sant'Angelo on the other side of the Tiber. The Passetto is an 800-meter-long covered passageway built along an old defensive wall constructed in the 9th century by Pope Leo IV to protect against Saracen raids. The corridor itself, in its present form, was created at the end of the 13th century by order of Pope Nicholas III. The narrow stone tunnel with loopholes allowed the popes to move unnoticed from the palace to the impregnable fortress of Castel Sant'Angelo in case of danger. The most famous use of the Passetto occurred in May 1527, when Rome was catastrophically plundered by the troops of Emperor Charles V. The mercenary soldiers, consisting mainly of German Lutherans and Spanish Catholics, broke away from their command and descended on the Eternal City with unprecedented cruelty. The looting began, which went down in history as the Sacco di Roma, one of the most terrible events of the Renaissance. Pope Clement VII was in the Vatican at the time of the attack. When it became clear that the city could not be held, the Swiss Guard formed a corridor to cover the pontiff's retreat. 189 of the 190 guardsmen died defending the Pope as he fled along the Passetto to Castel Sant'Angelo. Only 42 guardsmen reached the fortress with the Pope and 13 cardinals. This sacrifice is still honored today with an annual ceremony on May 6th when new Swiss guardsmen are sworn in. Clement VII spent 7 months under siege in Castel Sant'Angelo. Below, mercenaries plundered and destroyed Rome, killing residents, desecrating churches, and stealing priceless treasures. The Pope watched this nightmare from the windows of the fortress, powerless to do anything. The ransom for his release was 400,000 ducats, an astronomical sum. It was not until December that the Pope was able to leave the castle, disguised as a merchant, and flee Rome. The Passetto was used for escapes later on as well. In 1943, when German troops occupied Rome after Italy's surrender, Jews and refugees hiding in the Vatican were smuggled out through the underground passages. The neutral status of the Papal States made it a refuge for the persecuted, and the secret tunnels allowed people to be moved unnoticed by the occupying authorities. In December 2024, the Passetto was reopened to the public after extensive restoration. Tourists can now walk through this historic corridor, see the loopholes from which defenders fired during sieges, and feel the atmosphere of medieval drama. The walls of the corridor preserve the memory of several centuries of papal history, from triumphs to disasters. But the Passetto is only the most famous of the Vatican's underground passages. There is a whole network of tunnels under the Papal Palace, some of which date back to the Middle Ages, while others were created in later periods. Some connect different buildings of the complex, while others lead to secret exits outside the walls. The exact map of these passages is secret, and only special Vatican services have access to most of them. During the Cold War, a modern bomb shelter was built under the Vatican, equipped with life support systems, food supplies, and communications equipment. This secret facility was intended to shelter the Pope and the Church's top leadership in the event of a nuclear war. Virtually nothing is known to the public about its exact location and technical characteristics. Its existence has been confirmed, but the details are classified. The underground Vatican is a multi-layered structure where ancient necropolises coexist with medieval tunnels, Renaissance hiding places with modern bunkers. Each era added its own layer to this underground labyrinth, and there are still areas where archaeologists have never set foot. Corridors whose existence is known only to a few initiates. What else is hidden in these depths? In addition to well-known tunnels such as the Passetto, there is an extensive network of lesser-known underground structures beneath the Vatican. Many of them were discovered by accident during renovation or construction work. Each of these corridors and underground rooms tells its own story of how the popes and their entourage used the underground space for various purposes, from storing treasures to sheltering during wars. In the 16th century, when the papacy was going through a period of war and political turmoil, a whole system of secret rooms was created under the Vatican Palace. Some of them served as storage for the most valuable documents and artifacts. In case of sudden danger, the most important relics and papers could be hidden in these underground hiding places, from where even enemies who had captured the palace would not be able to get them. Of particular interest are the medieval and Renaissance cellars where the papal treasury was kept. Gold, silver, precious stones, valuable property deeds, all of this required reliable protection. Thick stone walls, massive doors with multiple locks, guards. The treasury dungeons were veritable underground fortresses. Some of these storage facilities are still in use today. Archaeologists have discovered the remains of aqueducts and cisterns under the Vatican that supplied water to ancient Rome. Roman engineers laid water tunnels under Vatican Hill, some of which remained in use until the Middle Ages. In times of siege, a reliable water supply was a matter of survival. Therefore, the popes took care to maintain the ancient water systems in working order and to create reserve cisterns. In the 20th century, especially between the First and Second World Wars, the engineering communications under the Vatican were modernized. Electric cables, ventilation shafts, and modern water and sewage systems were installed. These technical tunnels formed another layer of the underground Vatican, industrial, prosaic, but no less important for the functioning of the modern city-state. A special category is made up of bomb shelters built during World War II and the Cold War. Although the Vatican remained neutral, the threat of bombing was real. In 1943, the Allies did indeed launch airstrikes on Rome, and several bombs fell very close to the borders of the Papal State. After the war, during the era of nuclear confrontation, modern, deep-lying fortifications were built. There are also underground facilities related to the daily life of the Vatican. These include extensive storage facilities for food, fuel, and spare parts for equipment, as well as workshops where restorers and craftsmen work to restore works of art and artifacts from museum collections. Archive storage rooms, where millions of documents are kept under controlled temperature and humidity conditions. Some underground spaces were used for quite unexpected purposes. During the Renaissance, several popes kept exotic animals in underground rooms, gifts from foreign rulers. Lions, leopards, and even an elephant were kept in specially equipped cellars under the Vatican gardens. It was a demonstration of papal power and wealth, the ability to keep wild animals in the heart of the Christian world. The modern Vatican uses underground rooms for museum storage. The Vatican museums have enormous collections, only a small part of which is on public display. Tens of thousands of works of art, sculptures, and artifacts are stored in specially equipped underground storage facilities, where optimal conditions for preservation are maintained. Interestingly, many of the Vatican's underground rooms have not yet been systematically explored. When the heating system was being renovated in the 1990s, workers discovered a previously unknown corridor dating back to around the 15th century. Where it led, and what it was intended for, remains a mystery. It was simply included in the technical communications scheme. One can only guess how many more such forgotten tunnels may be hidden under the Papal Palace. The Vatican Apostolic Archives, formerly known as the Secret Archives, deserve a special mention. The word secret comes from the Latin secretum, meaning personal or private, not necessarily classified. Nevertheless, for centuries these archives remained closed to outsiders, giving rise to many legends and conspiracy theories about what exactly is stored in their depths. The archives occupy a huge space, most of which is located underground. According to various estimates, the shelves with documents stretch for 85 kilometers. They contain papal bulls, correspondence between pontiffs and monarchs of all countries, minutes of church councils, Inquisition court cases, financial reports, diplomatic reports, everything that documents 2,000 years of Catholic Church history. The oldest documents date back to the 8th century AD. Earlier papers were lost during the numerous relocations of the papal throne, wars, and looting. Particularly catastrophic events occurred in 1987, when the German Emperor Otto III took a significant part of the archives to Germany, and in 1527, when many documents were lost during the sacking of Rome. The modern systematization of the archives began at the end of the 16th century under Pope Paul V, who founded an official archive repository in 1612. The specially constructed building was adjacent to the Vatican Library, but had its own storage facilities and cataloging system. Since then, the archives have been constantly replenished with documents from various church institutions around the world. Access to the archives was strictly limited until 1881, when Pope Leo XIII partially opened them to qualified researchers. However, even after that, there were significant restrictions. Documents relating to the last 75 years remained closed. Exceptions were rare and required special permission from the Pope. In 2019, Pope Francis renamed the secret archives to the Apostolic Archives, wishing to dispel the aura of mystery. In March 2020, he opened the documents of the pontificate of Pius XVIII, the Pope who ruled during World War II. This decision aroused enormous interest among scholars, as the role of the Vatican during the Holocaust remains a subject of controversy. Thousands of historians have applied to study these papers. Physically, the archives are an impressive sight. The underground storage facilities are equipped with a modern climate control system that maintains an optimal temperature of 18 degrees Celsius and a humidity level of about 50%. A special air filtration system protects the documents from contamination. The fire protection system uses inert gas instead of water, which could damage the priceless parchments. The documents are stored in steel shelves that extend dozens of meters underground. Each collection has its own organizational system. Some documents are stored in special sealed containers filled with inert gas. Particularly valuable parchments are placed between sheets of acid-free paper. Access to the archives is strictly controlled. Researchers work only in the reading room, where the requested materials are delivered to them. Among the most famous documents in the archive are the papal bull excommunicating Martin Luther, Michelangelo's correspondence, letters from Mary Stuart, the minutes of Galileo Galilei's trial, and English King Henry VIII's petition for an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Each of these documents is key to understanding the turning points in European history. But most of the archives contain routine administrative documents, appointments of bishops, financial reports of dioceses, decisions on canonical disputes, the usual bureaucratic work of the Church over the centuries. It is these boring papers that often prove most valuable to historians, allowing them to reconstruct the daily life of the Church and society. Between the floor level of the modern St. Peter's Basilica and the ancient Necropolis lies an intermediate layer, the Vatican grottoes. This is a system of underground chapels and corridors created in the 16th century during the construction of the new basilica. The grottoes serve as a burial place for popes, cardinals, and some monarchs who have been honored with burial in the most sacred place in the Catholic world. When Pope Julius II decided to demolish the ancient Constantine Basilica and build a new one in 1506, the architects were faced with a difficult task. It was necessary to raise the floor level of the new church while maintaining access to St. Peter's tomb. The solution was to create an intermediate level, grottoes located about 3 meters below the floor of the modern basilica. The grottoes are a semi-underground church with vaulted ceilings supported by massive pylons on which the basilica rests. Visitors descend the steps from the central nave and enter a world of subdued lighting, marble tombstones, and quiet prayer. The atmosphere here is completely different from the dazzlingly luxurious basilica above. More intimate, focused, conducive to reflection on the transience of life. 91 popes are buried here. Their tombstones line the corridors, from the pontiffs of the Renaissance to the popes of the 21st century. John Paul II was buried here in 2005, in a simple marble tomb at the entrance to the grottoes. His tomb immediately became a place of pilgrimage. Every day, thousands of believers descend to pray at the burial place of their beloved pope. Several queens and emperors rest alongside the popes. Queen Christina of Sweden, who converted to Catholicism and renounced the throne, is buried in the grottoes, one of the few women to be granted this honor. The Holy Roman Emperors, Otto II and Otto III, also found their final resting place in these underground chapels, highlighting the close relationship between papal and imperial power in the Middle Ages. At the center of the grottoes, directly beneath the main altar of the basilica, is the Clementine Chapel, a circular room built around the ancient burial place of St. Peter. From here, through a grate, you can see part of the ancient necropolis located one level below. Pilgrims stop here to pray, feeling physically close to the place where the first apostle was buried, almost 2,000 years ago. The architecture of the grottoes reflects different eras. Some of the rooms have retained elements from the 16th century, when they were created. Other chapels were rebuilt or decorated in the 17th and 18th centuries. Mosaics, frescoes, and marble reliefs create a rich visual environment. Each chapel is dedicated to a specific saint or religious event, forming an underground gallery of Catholic spirituality. The lighting in the grottoes is carefully designed. Soft light emphasizes the texture of the marble and the shine of the gilding, creating an atmosphere of peace. In contrast to the brightly lit basilica above, the grottoes are dimly lit, encouraging meditation. The sound of footsteps echoes under the arches, creating an acoustic effect that enhances the feeling of being in a sacred space between the earthly and the eternal. Access to the grottoes is free for all visitors to the basilica. Thousands of tourists and pilgrims descend here every day to honor the memory of the popes and get closer to the tomb of St. Peter. For devout Catholics, this is one of the most emotionally significant moments of a visit to the Vatican. The opportunity to literally touch the history of the Church, to walk on the same stones where generations of Christians have prayed. The Vatican grottoes serve as a physical and symbolic bridge between the modern Church and its apostolic roots. They connect the Baroque splendor of Bernini's Basilica with the ascetic simplicity of early Christian burials. Descending the steps from one level to another, visitors literally travel back in time, from the 21st century through the Renaissance and the Middle Ages to antiquity. Each layer tells its own chapter in the long history of this sacred place. In 2003, during construction work on a parking lot next to the Vatican museums, workers stumbled upon something unexpected. An excavator fell into a void, exposing ancient brickwork. Archaeologists immediately arrived at the site and discovered another extensive Roman necropolis, previously unknown. It was the necropolis of Via Triumphalis, the road along which the triumphal processions of Roman commanders passed in ancient times. The discovery was sensational. The new necropolis was located about 100 meters north of St. Peter's Basilica, on the opposite slope of the same Vatican hill. Like the necropolis under the basilica, it was a pagan city of the dead, dating from the 2nd to 4th centuries AD. But unlike the first one, which was buried by Constantine in the 4th century, this necropolis remained accessible and was used for much longer. Archaeological excavations continued for several years. Scientists discovered more than 40 burial structures in varying degrees of preservation. The mausoleums lined an ancient road, forming a street about 100 meters long. Many of the burials belonged to families of freedmen, former slaves who had gained their freedom and achieved a certain level of prosperity in imperial Rome. The state of preservation of the Via Triumphalis necropolis was excellent. The frescoes on the walls retained their bright colors, the mosaic floors remained virtually intact, and the inscriptions were clearly legible. This allowed archaeologists to obtain detailed information about the people buried here, their professions, family ties, and religious beliefs. Each inscription opened a small window into the lives of ordinary Romans in the first centuries of our era. Particularly interesting were the signs of gradual Christianization. The Via Triumphalis necropolis shows the same process of religious transition as the necropolis under the Basilica, from purely pagan burials in the 2nd century to mixed burials in the 3rd century, and clearly Christian burials in the 4th and 5th centuries. The symbols changed, but people continued to bury their loved ones in the same family mausoleums. After the archaeological research was completed, the Vatican decided to make the necropolis accessible to the public. In 2010, a new tourist route was opened, allowing visitors to descend into the ancient cemetery. This was the first time that such an archaeological site in the Vatican had become a full-fledged museum with regular tours. Visiting the Via Triumphalis necropolis has become a unique experience for tourists. Unlike the necropolis under the Basilica, access to which is strictly limited and requires special permission months in advance, you can get here simply by buying a ticket to the Vatican museums. Tours are conducted several times a day in different languages, allowing the general public to see what was hidden underground just 20 years ago. The route passes through several mausoleums, each with its own history. The guide talks about the funeral customs of the ancient Romans, explains the symbolism of the frescoes and mosaics, and reads ancient epitaphs. Visitors can see sarcophagi with original skeletal remains, funerary urns, and personal items placed in the graves alongside the deceased. The atmosphere of authenticity makes the past tangible. The lighting of the necropolis is designed to emphasize the drama of the ancient burials. Spotlights pick out the frescoes from the darkness, creating a play of light and shadow. This is not only an aesthetic effect, but also a means of protection. Minimal lighting prevents the colors from fading. When a tour group passes by, the lights come on and then go out again, returning the necropolis to its protective semi-darkness. In 2023, the Vatican museums expanded access to the necropolis by increasing the number of tours and improving the infrastructure. New information stands, video materials, and augmented reality have appeared, allowing visitors to see what the mausoleums looked like in ancient times. Modern technology helps visitors mentally transport themselves back 2,000 years, when the funeral processions of pagan Rome walked this road. Archaeological research of the underground Vatican continues in the 21st century, using the latest technology that scientists in the mid-20th century could not even dream of. Modern methods allow us to study underground structures without resorting to destructive excavations, preserving the archaeological heritage for future generations while expanding our knowledge of the past. Ground-penetrating radar scanning has become one of the main tools of modern Vatican archaeology. This technology uses radio waves to create images of subsurface structures. The ground-penetrating radar is moved across the surface, and it sends pulses deep into the ground. The reflected signals create a map of what is underground: voids, walls, burials. In this way, previously unknown rooms can be discovered without a single shovel. In the 2010s, ground-penetrating radar was used to discover several unknown underground structures beneath the Vatican. One of them turned out to be a Roman domus, a residential building from the 2nd century AD, located on the slope of Vatican Hill even before the creation of the Necropolis. Another was a system of tunnels, the purpose of which has not yet been established. These finds await future excavations when the resources and need for their study arise. Three-dimensional laser scanning has made it possible to create highly accurate digital models of already discovered necropolises. Every centimeter of the mausoleums, every fresco, every inscription has been digitized with millimeter precision. This data is used to monitor the condition of archaeological sites. Any changes, cracks, or shifts are immediately recorded by a computer. In addition, digital models allow researchers around the world to study Vatican finds virtually. Multispectral photography has helped to read faded or damaged inscriptions. This technology photographs an object in different ranges of the light spectrum, from ultraviolet to infrared. Often, inscriptions invisible to the human eye appear in certain ranges. Using this method, it was possible to decipher several graffiti on the walls of the Necropolis that were considered lost. Radiocarbon dating and DNA analysis are used to study human remains from ancient burials. Modern technologies allow us to determine not only the age and sex of a person at the time of death, but also their origin, diet, diseases they suffered from, and even the degree of kinship between people buried in the same mausoleum. This turns nameless bones into real people with stories. Chemical analysis of the pigments used in ancient frescoes reveals the techniques used by Roman artists. Scientists have determined that red ochre was mined in certain regions of Italy, while blue lapis lazuli was imported from Afghanistan, indicating a developed trade in pigments. Analysis of binding agents has shown exactly what techniques ancient craftsmen used to create durable frescoes. Climate monitoring using temperature and humidity sensors helps keep the conditions just right for preserving archaeological sites. The system tracks the microclimate in each room of the necropolis in real time and automatically adjusts the settings. This is super important because the flow of visitors affects humidity and temperature, which can damage ancient materials. Virtual and augmented reality open up new opportunities for presenting archaeological finds to the public. Visitors can put on special glasses and see the mausoleum as it was 2,000 years ago, with intact frescoes full of color, with furniture and household items. This makes the past more understandable and vivid, especially for the younger generation. International cooperation allows the world's best specialists to be involved in the study of Vatican finds. Scientists from the universities of Rome, Oxford, Harvard, and Tokyo are working together on various aspects of the underground Vatican. This interdisciplinary approach, bringing together archaeologists, anthropologists, chemists, physicists, and art historians, provides a much more complete picture of the past than the work of individual specialists could provide. Despite all the archaeological discoveries of recent decades, a significant part of the Vatican underground remains unexplored. Ground-penetrating radar scans indicate the presence of numerous voids, tunnels, and rooms that archaeologists have not yet explored. Some of these structures may prove to be as significant as the already discovered necropolises, while others may simply be old cellars or abandoned utility tunnels. But until they are explored, each void remains a mystery. There are areas that are closed to research for technical reasons. Under some parts of the Vatican Palace and museums are ancient structures, the excavation of which could threaten the stability of the buildings above. Modern engineering allows for many things, but the risk of damage to priceless Renaissance and Baroque structures is too great. These areas have been mothballed until technology allows for safe exploration. Certain areas remain closed for security and confidentiality reasons. Cold War bunkers, tunnel systems related to the Vatican's modern security, and rooms where particularly valuable artifacts are stored are accessible only to authorized persons. The Vatican remains a sovereign state with its own secrets, and not everything in its depths is intended for public viewing. Archaeologists have various theories about what might be found in the unexplored sections. Some believe that the remains of the villa of Emperor Caligula or Nero, which, according to historical sources, was located on Vatican Hill, may lie beneath the Vatican. The foundations of the imperial buildings may have been preserved under later layers. Their discovery would provide invaluable material for understanding the architecture and lifestyle of the Roman emperors. Another intriguing possibility is the existence of additional early Christian burials. If Peter was executed and buried on Vatican Hill, other Christian martyrs of Nero's time may have found their final resting place here as well. The mass executions of 64 AD claimed the lives of hundreds or thousands of Christians. The bodies of many of them may have been secretly buried by fellow believers in the same necropolis. Such burials, if discovered, would be important evidence of early Christianity. Legends about treasures hidden in the Vatican's underground chambers have existed for centuries. It is historically known that during times of war and instability, popes hid their most valuable relics and treasures in secret places. Not all of these hiding places were ever found. It is quite possible that somewhere in forgotten underground rooms, precious items hidden during some crisis and never retrieved are still stored. The question of the completeness of the investigation of the necropolis under the Basilica remains open. The excavations of the 1940s covered an area about 70 meters long along one street, but the necropolis was certainly much larger. The ancient Via Cornelia stretched for hundreds of meters, and it is logical to assume that dozens, if not hundreds, of other mausoleums were located along it. Much of this ancient city of the dead is still hidden underground. Financial and practical considerations limit archaeological activity in the Vatican. Excavations are extremely expensive, require highly skilled specialists, and take years to complete. After the discovery, the finds must be preserved and maintained, which also requires ongoing costs. The Vatican has a limited budget and many other priorities, from social programs to the maintenance of existing museums. Therefore, new large-scale excavations are planned only when there is a special need. Technological progress gives hope that future generations of archaeologists will be able to explore unexplored areas more efficiently and safely. Advances in robotics will allow miniature probes to be sent into narrow tunnels and inaccessible rooms. Improvements in geophysical exploration methods will provide more detailed maps of subsurface structures. New conservation technologies will help to better preserve the finds. Perhaps in 20 or 50 years, secrets that are inaccessible today will be revealed. The underground Vatican remains a space where reality intertwines with mystery, where established facts coexist with legends, where each discovery raises new questions. This is a place where the physical layers of the earth correspond to the layers of history. Pagan Rome, early Christianity, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, modern times, all these eras literally lie on top of each other. And who knows what other stories these ancient stones will tell when the time comes?